My parents said you're not invited at my sister's wedding. 3 days later they begged me to pay $38,000. My parents planned my sister's wedding for 18 months straight. Then they told me I wasn't invited. My own sister didn't even call to explain why. I sat alone in my apartment, deleting the save the date off my fridge. 3 days of silence passed. Then my mother called, sobbing, begging me for $38,000. She had no idea what I actually owned, and she was about to find out in front of everyone she cared about. My name is Maya Bennett. I'm 32. And I've spent the last 6 years building a design studio in Denver that finally pays my bills without anyone's help. My parents, Rick and Linda, live 20 minutes away in Littleton with my younger sister Chloe, who at 27 was about to marry Preston Cole, son of one of the wealthiest developers in the state, in a wedding that had consumed our entire family for over a year. Growing up, I was the responsible one, and Chloe was the golden one, and everyone in my family understood that distinction without ever needing to say it out loud at the dinner table. When Chloe forgot her cleats, I drove them to school before first period. When she failed algebra, I tutored her every night until midnight for 6 weeks straight. Nobody ever asked me to do these things. I simply did them. The way water always finds the lowest point in a room. My mother used to say I was built different, which sounded like a compliment until I eventually realized it actually meant I was expected to need less than everyone else around me. Less attention, less help, less celebration for my own accomplishments. Chloe's science fair project got a party with a cake shaped like a volcano. My valedictorian speech, 3 years later, got a polite nod and a quiet warning not to let it go to my head. By the time I was 22, freshly graduated and barely employed, I'd already loaned my father $4,000 for a truck repair he never once mentioned again, let alone repaid in any form. It wasn't resentment yet. Not really. Not something I could name. It was just the family arithmetic I'd grown up doing without complaint. The quiet, invisible tax levied on the daughter who could always be counted on to handle things. My grandmother Eleanor, my mother's mother, was the only person who ever seemed to genuinely notice the imbalance running underneath our entire family. She'd pull me aside at holidays, away from the noise of the kitchen, and say, "You're the one holding this family together, Maya. And one day they're going to forget who actually built the roof over their heads." I never fully understood what she meant until years later. Long after she was gone, Eleanor died when I was 26, quietly, in her sleep, and she left something behind that nobody in my family knew existed, tucked into a trust with conditions so specific they felt like a private message written just for me alone. I didn't touch any of it for a long time afterward. I didn't even tell my parents the trust existed, sensing somehow that revealing it too early would only invite the wrong kind of attention. Instead, I kept doing what I'd always done, quietly, without fanfare, without expecting recognition. When my father's landscaping business hit a rough patch one winter, I quietly covered 2 months of payroll so his longtime employees wouldn't quit on him. When Chloe needed a semester of tuition her scholarship didn't fully cover, I wired the money before she'd even finished asking me the full question over the phone. Nobody in my family ever called it what it actually was. My mother called it helping out, said gently, like it cost nothing. My father called it keeping things running, said briskly, like a fact of business. Chloe, to this day, still has no real idea how much of her adult life was quietly financed by her older sister's overtime hours and a business she was building on almost no sleep at all. I told myself it didn't matter. That family was family. That showing up mattered more than getting credit for showing up. But there's a particular, corrosive kind of exhaustion that comes from being loved conditionally, from knowing deep down that you're valued primarily for what you provide, rather than simply for who you actually are underneath all the providing. And that exhaustion had been quietly accumulating in me for years. When Preston Cole proposed to Chloe at a rooftop restaurant downtown, my mother called me before she called anyone else in the family, not out of any particular closeness between us, but because she needed help planning immediately and knew exactly who to call for that. "You're so good at this stuff," she said warmly. And I heard. Once again. With painful clarity. Exactly what my role in this family was always going to be. I threw myself into it anyway. Because some stubborn part of me still believed that this time, doing enough would finally earn me something different. Something warmer. I sourced florists across 3 counties, negotiated hard with caterers, found the venue coordinator myself, and stayed up countless nights building spreadsheets nobody had asked me to build, but that everyone in my family fully expected to simply exist by morning. The wedding was set for the fall at a boutique venue called the Renfield, a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and dramatic skylights that Chloe fell in love with the very moment she toured it that spring. My mother mentioned the venue's name a dozen times over the following weeks, never once suspecting the strange, quiet connection it already had to me and to a decision I'd made years earlier. 3 years earlier. I had quietly become a 40% silent partner in the Renfield, using part of my grandmother's trust alongside my old college roommate Nora, who ran the venue's day-to-day operations while I stayed almost entirely behind the scenes. My family knew, vaguely, that I did some investing on the side. They never once asked what that investing actually involved, and I never volunteered the details. So when my mother excitedly announced Chloe's venue booking over Sunday dinner, practically glowing with pride at having secured such a beautiful space, I sat there with a fork frozen in my hand and said absolutely nothing, watching my own family celebrate a decision I had, in a very real and literal sense, already made possible years earlier without a single one of them knowing it. The first real crack came 2 months before the wedding, during a phone call about the catering deposit that was supposed to be routine. My mother asked, almost casually, if I could help out again, just this once. Like always, and something inside me finally stalled instead of agreeing automatically the way I always had, the way my whole body had been conditioned to respond for over a decade. "I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to sound in that moment. "I have my own business, my own bills, my own life to actually build. I've already covered more than any of you realize, more than I've ever said out loud." The silence on the other end of the line felt heavier and colder than any argument we'd ever had before. My mother's tone shifted instantly, from warm and familiar to clipped and distant. "We're not asking for charity, Maya. We're asking for basic family support during a stressful time. I didn't realize helping your own sister get married was such an enormous burden for you to carry." I felt the old, familiar guilt rising in my chest, worn smooth and deep from years of exactly this kind of pressure. I held my ground anyway, barely, my knuckles white around the phone. "I'll come to the wedding. I'll help with logistics wherever I can. But I can't keep bankrolling decisions I'm not even part of making," my mother said. "We'll talk about it later," in a voice that made it painfully clear she was already discussing it with someone else entirely, someone who wasn't me. 2 days later, my father called, which almost never happened between us. "Your mother's upset," he said, skipping any greeting entirely and going straight for the point. "You embarrassed her, saying you wouldn't help. Chloe's stressed enough without you making everything about money right now." I asked him when Chloe had ever actually said that herself, in her own words, and he had no answer for me. I started noticing small things I'd trained myself not to notice before. Things I'd quietly ignored for years out of self-preservation. How every group text about the wedding somehow excluded me from certain planning threads. How bridesmaid photos appeared online without me in a single frame. How Chloe's engagement party invitation had listed my parents as hosts and simply forgotten to list me as a guest at all until I asked directly. When I brought it up gently to Chloe over the phone, careful not to sound accusatory, she laughed it off almost immediately. "You're always so busy, Maya. I figured you'd rather not deal with the group chat chaos anyway." It sounded reasonable enough on the surface. It also sounded like something she'd been coached to say, rehearsed rather than genuinely felt. The words slightly too smooth around the edges. I let it go. because that's what I always did in situations like this. But the letting go itself was starting to cost me something I couldn't quite name yet. Something quietly eroding underneath the surface. I found myself dreading family calls instead of answering them on the first ring the way I used to. Always eager. Always available. Always ready to fix whatever needed fixing. My friend Priya, who'd known me since our sophomore year of college, noticed the change in me before I could even fully articulate it to myself. "You look like you're bracing for something every single time your mom calls," she said over coffee one gray Saturday morning, watching my face carefully. I laughed it off too. The family reflex apparently deeply contagious even outside of family itself. "They just need help with the wedding," I told her, sipping my latte a little too fast to seem convincing. "It's a lot of moving pieces. That's all." Priya raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Since when do you sound this tired helping people you supposedly love?" I didn't have a good answer ready, so I changed the subject to her own upcoming trip to Portugal instead. The tension simmered quietly through August, showing up in small, cumulative ways. My mother forwarding vendor emails at midnight and expecting instant replies by morning. My father asking if I could look over the catering contract without ever offering to pay me for the hours I spent doing it. Chloe going radio silent for weeks at a stretch whenever things got difficult between the two of us. I kept telling myself this was temporary. Ordinary wedding stress. The kind of thing families push through together and later laugh about at holidays. I did not yet understand. Not fully. How far my parents were actually willing to go in order to protect an image they had been quietly propping up for years with money that was never really, truly theirs to begin with. Then, on a Tuesday evening in September, exactly 6 weeks before the wedding, my mother called and asked me to come over for dinner. Her voice unusually gentle and careful in a way that immediately put me on edge. I should have recognized that particular gentleness for exactly what it was. The calm my parents always used right before delivering bad news they had already fully decided on. I drove to Littleton that night with a bottle of wine and absolutely no idea I was about to be uninvited from my own sister's wedding. My parents' house looked the same as it always had. The porch light glowing warm and yellow. Chloe's old bike still leaning against the garage from high school, untouched, gathering dust in the exact same spot it had for years. Dinner started normally enough. My mother serving the same roast chicken she always made specifically for difficult conversations, as if good food alone could soften whatever came next. My father talked at length about a landscaping contract he'd landed for a new subdivision, his voice a little too enthusiastic and rehearsed for an ordinary Tuesday, the excitement clearly manufactured to fill space. It was my mother who finally set down her fork and said, carefully, "Maya, we need to talk about the wedding guest list." I remember feeling my stomach drop before I even fully understood why. Some animal part of me already sensing the exact shape of what was coming for me, bracing itself instinctively before my conscious mind had caught up. "The Coles are very particular about optics," she continued, choosing each word like she was carefully defusing something dangerous. "Preston's family has certain expectations about who attends, and given the tension lately between all of us, we think it might genuinely be easier if you sat this particular one out. Just for now. Just this once." I laughed. Actually laughed out loud, because it sounded so absurd to me that I assumed at first I'd simply misheard her entirely. Sat what out? The wedding. My own sister's wedding. My father wouldn't meet my eyes at all, suddenly very interested in cutting his chicken into smaller and smaller pieces on his plate, refusing to look up even once. "It's not permanent," my mother said quickly, as if that somehow made it better. Softer. Easier to swallow. "It's just, with everything you said about not wanting to help financially, and the way you've been lately, we think it's best for everyone if you're simply not there this time. We'll explain it properly to people who ask." "Explain what to people?" asked, my voice climbing higher than I wanted it to, cracking slightly at the edges. "That your older daughter isn't invited to her own sister's wedding? What exactly is the explanation you're planning to give?" "Mom," She looked down at her plate instead of answering me directly, avoiding my eyes entirely. My father finally spoke, his voice flat, careful, clearly rehearsed in advance. You've made it pretty clear you don't want to be part of this the way we actually need you to be. Chloe deserves one day without conflict hanging over it. This is what's best for her. For all of us. He said it like a verdict already handed down, not a discussion open for debate. I have never once caused conflict at a wedding I wasn't even invited to help plan properly, I said, my hands shaking visibly around my wine glass now. I've paid for things, planned things, stayed up nights for things, and now I'm being punished for simply saying I can't keep paying for everything indefinitely, forever. Without question. My mother's expression hardened into something I recognized instantly from childhood. The particular look she gave when a decision had already been fully made and my objections were simply noise to be patiently waited out until I stopped talking. This isn't a punishment, Maya. It's a boundary. We're allowed to have boundaries too, you know. Same as you. The word boundary landed like a slap across my face, borrowed straight from the language I'd used myself weeks earlier when I'd said I couldn't keep funding things blindly anymore. They'd taken my own careful vocabulary and turned it into a weapon aimed directly back at me. And it worked exactly as effectively as they clearly intended it to. I asked if Chloe knew about this conversation, if this was even really her decision at all. And my mother's brief hesitation before answering told me absolutely everything I needed to know. She agrees it's for the best, my mother said, though the pause before it strongly suggested Chloe had mostly just agreed to stop arguing about it. Exhausted. I left before dessert, the roast chicken sitting untouched on my plate, my father still avoiding my eyes entirely, my mother already reaching for her phone as if the hard part of the evening was finally over, and she could move on to whatever needed handling next on her endless list of tasks. I sat in my car outside their house for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive away, staring at the porch light I'd walked under my entire childhood, trying desperately to understand how 30 years of consistently showing up had somehow led to this exact door closing on me, quietly and without any real warning at all. When I got home, I opened my laptop out of some numb, automatic instinct and found the wedding website my mother had built months earlier, the one carefully listing every family member by name. My own name had already been quietly removed from the parents of the bride's family section, erased sometime in the last few hours without any conversation. I texted Chloe that night. Just one short line. Did you know about this? She didn't respond for 11 long hours. And when she finally did reply, all she wrote back was, "Can we talk later? It's complicated," which felt, in that moment, like the least complicated answer of all the possible ones she could have given me. Word traveled fast through my extended family, the way it always inevitably does, filtered and reshaped by whoever happened to tell the story first. My Aunt Diane called within 2 days, her voice thick with the particular kind of concern people perform right before they ask an invasive, prying question they've been dying to ask. "I heard there was some drama about the wedding," she said, clearly fishing for details. I told her the truth, plainly, without any embellishment, and I could hear her visibly adjusting her assumptions in real time over the phone, the story she'd initially heard clearly not matching whatever version had reached her first through the family grapevine. "That doesn't sound like your mother at all," Diane said carefully, and I realized then, with a sinking clarity, that my parents had already begun controlling the narrative before I'd even fully processed what happened myself, painting themselves as reasonable people simply managing an unreasonable, money-obsessed older daughter who couldn't be satisfied. I stopped answering extended family calls after that conversation, not out of anger exactly, but pure exhaustion. The specific kind that comes from being repeatedly asked to defend your own lived reality against a competing story someone else got to tell first, more sympathetically, before you even had a chance to speak. At work, Priya watched me push through client meetings with the practiced calm I'd built over years of never letting my family's chaos leak into my professional life. "You look terrible," she finally said one gray afternoon. Not unkindly. Just honestly. Setting down the mock-up she'd been reviewing to look me directly in the eye. I told her everything that had happened. The dinner. The boundary language. The wedding website. All of it in a rush. And she went very quiet for a long moment before saying, Maya. That's not a boundary. That's punishment with better PR attached to it. Something in me finally cracked hearing someone else name it that clearly. That night I pulled out an old folder I kept, half out of habit and half out of some deep instinct for self-preservation, documenting every wire transfer, every quiet loan my family had never once repaid, going back nearly a full decade. The total. Once I actually sat down and added it all up carefully, genuinely stunned even me. $61,000, give or take a few hundred, had moved quietly from my accounts into theirs over the years, none of it ever discussed openly as debt, all of it fully absorbed into the family's unspoken understanding of how things simply worked, how Maya simply handled things without complaint or expectation of repayment. I didn't cry that night, though I had genuinely expected to at some point during the process. Instead, I felt something colder and much clearer settle into place inside me. The strange sensation of finally seeing an entire pattern I'd spent years standing too close to actually recognize clearly for what it was. My grandmother's voice came back to me unbidden that night. That old line about the roof and who actually built it. And for the very first time I understood it not as simple comfort but as a genuine warning she tried carefully to give me while she was still alive and able to explain it. I called Nora, my business partner at the Renfield, not to talk about the wedding directly at all, just to check in on general venue operations, and she mentioned offhand that a booking for a Bennett Cole wedding had just come through officially for late October. The deposit already processed that morning. I felt my whole body go completely still on the other end of the phone. Bennett Cole, I repeated slowly, testing the sound of it. Nora, who had no idea about my family situation beyond the vague outlines I'd shared over the years, said, Yeah. Big deposit. Coordinators thrilled. Should be a beautiful one. You okay? You sound strange. I told her I was fine, that it was just a coincidence with a name I happened to recognize from somewhere, and got off the phone as quickly as I reasonably could without alarming her further, my mind already racing through the strange, almost impossibly cosmic timing of it all unfolding right in front of me. My own sister's wedding, the one I'd been uninvited from just days earlier over roast chicken, was going to take place in a venue I partly owned, funded in part by money my own grandmother had left specifically because she'd apparently seen this exact family clearly enough, years in advance, to quietly prepare for it. I didn't tell Nora the full story that particular night, and I didn't tell my parents either. Not yet. I simply sat with the strange knowledge instead, turning it over slowly in my palm like a smooth stone, unsure yet whether it was going to become a weapon or simply remain a sad, quiet irony. Chloe finally called. 9 full days after that dinner. Her voice small in a way I hadn't heard from her since she was a scared teenager afraid to tell our parents she'd failed her driving test the first time. I didn't ask them to uninvite you, she said immediately, before I'd even said hello. But you didn't push back either, I said. Not unkindly. Just honestly. Waiting for her response. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end. Mom said it would ruin everything if I made a thing of it. I didn't know what to do. Maya. Honestly. I still don't know what to do. I told her I understood. And mostly I genuinely did. Because I still remembered clearly being 27 myself and terrified of disappointing our parents, before I'd finally learned the hard way that disappointing them wasn't actually the catastrophe they'd spent years training both of us to believe it was. I still want you there, Chloe said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I just don't know how to fix this without starting another huge fight. I told her I appreciated that sentiment, genuinely. But that fixing it wasn't only her responsibility to carry alone, and I wasn't going to beg my way back into any room. We hung up without any real resolution that night. But something had shifted slightly between us. A small crack of daylight appearing in a door I'd assumed was already permanently shut. I didn't know yet whether it would actually matter in the end, but I let myself hold on to it anyway, carefully. Meanwhile, wedding planning apparently continued at full speed without me, judging by the vendor emails Nora occasionally mentioned in passing. Completely unaware they involved my own estranged family. The Coles, turned out, were heavily involved in the planning too, quietly funding a significant portion of the entire event themselves. My father's landscaping business, I later learned through Aunt Diane, had taken on a large new subdivision contract specifically timed around the wedding season, a project he'd apparently pitched aggressively to Gerald Cole, Preston's father, as proof of his own financial stability and considerable business acumen going forward. What none of us knew yet, myself included, was exactly how thin that projected stability actually was underneath the surface. How much of my father's sudden growth had been financed through short-term loans and increasingly risky bets meant to impress a family whose approval he desperately, quietly craved for reasons that went far beyond simply Chloe's happiness. For the first time in my entire life, I let myself sit back and genuinely watch, rather than instinctively rushing in to fix, hold, or fund whatever cracks appeared in front of me. And the view from that new, unfamiliar distance was deeply unsettling in ways I hadn't fully anticipated it would be. October arrived with an unexpected, welcome calm settling over everything. I threw myself fully into work, landing a large commercial design contract that required long hours but gave me a satisfying, uncomplicated kind of exhaustion, the kind that came entirely from effort I had chosen myself rather than effort extracted from me by others. Priya insisted we take a weekend trip up to the mountains. No phones allowed. No family drama permitted. Just hiking trails and overpriced hot chocolate in a tiny mountain town neither of us had visited before. For 2 full days. I didn't think once about wedding websites or roast chicken or boundaries weaponized against me. I started therapy again during that stretch. Something I'd stopped a year earlier when work got too busy to schedule around, and my therapist gently pointed out a pattern I already half suspected existed within me. I equated being needed with being loved, and my family had learned exactly how to exploit that equation for years. What would it feel like, she asked me one Tuesday session, to just let them handle a crisis without you stepping in? I didn't have a real answer for her yet, but the question lodged itself somewhere deep inside me that I couldn't easily shake loose from, no matter how hard I tried to move past it. At the Renfield, preparations for the Bennett-Cole wedding moved forward steadily throughout the month. Nora mentioned, during one of our regular check-ins, that the couple seemed genuinely lovely together, that the bride's mother was a bit intense about small details, which made me laugh harder than Nora could possibly have understood in the moment. I asked Nora, carefully and casually, not to mention my involvement in the venue to the client family, unless it became somehow relevant, framing it as a general preference for privacy around my personal investments. She agreed easily enough, having absolutely no reason to suspect there was any deeper story behind the simple request. Some nights I wondered if I was being unnecessarily secretive about the whole thing, if I should simply tell my parents outright that I co-owned their daughter's wedding venue, and let the resulting awkwardness play out honestly between us. But some quiet, patient instinct told me the timing mattered far more than the honesty itself right now. My grandmother's trust documents, which I finally reread in full during this quiet period, included a handwritten note clipped carefully to the legal paperwork itself. Some doors should stay closed until the right moment reveals itself, it read in her familiar, looping handwriting. You'll know the moment when it finally comes to you. I hadn't fully understood that note when I first received it years earlier, filing it away mentally as sentimental rather than genuinely instructive. Rereading it now, months into this slowly unfolding situation, it felt far less like simple sentiment and much more like a woman who had understood her family's patterns better than any of us ever realized. Chloe and I exchanged a handful of careful, tentative texts during this lull. Nothing about the wedding directly, just small updates about our separate lives. The kind of light contact that felt like testing weight carefully on thin ice before deciding whether it would actually hold your full weight or not. "I miss you," she wrote once, completely unprompted. Late on a quiet Thursday night. I wrote back that I missed her too, and meant it genuinely, even while knowing that missing someone deeply and being willing to keep being used by their family were, in the end, two entirely different things to reconcile. My father called once during this stretch, ostensibly to ask about a work reference I'd once given him for a supplier years earlier, but the conversation felt oddly probing throughout, like he was quietly checking on my current financial situation without ever asking me directly about it. I answered vaguely and let the call end quickly. I didn't know it yet, sitting there in my apartment, but that particular phone call came just as my father's subdivision contract began showing serious cracks behind the scenes, and just as the first vendor payment for Chloe's wedding quietly bounced, a fact my parents were working very hard to keep fully contained from everyone. The first real sign something was seriously wrong came from an unlikely source, my Aunt Diane, calling again. This time with noticeably less gossip in her voice and far more genuine worry. "Your father asked to borrow money from your Uncle Ray," she said quietly. "That's really not like him at all." "Maya." I asked how much, and she said she didn't know the exact figure, but that it had something to do with wedding costs running over, which struck me as genuinely odd given how much my parents had insisted, for months on end, that everything was completely under control and fully, comfortably funded already. I didn't reach out to my parents about it directly, still holding on to the fragile boundary I'd finally, painfully drawn. But I mentioned it to Priya over dinner, who raised an eyebrow and said, "Sounds like the roof you built might be about to leak on them specifically. And pretty soon too." Meanwhile, at the Renfield, Nora flagged something during our weekly operations call, almost as a casual aside between other topics. "The Bennett Cole deposit for the final catering balance bounced," she said. "First time that's happened with this particular client. Coordinators handling it. Probably just a simple bank error on their end." I felt my stomach tighten in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with coincidence anymore. "How much was the bounced payment exactly?" asked, trying carefully to keep my voice neutral and steady. Nora checked her notes quickly. "About 12,000. There's still a remaining balance due before the actual event too. On top of that." I didn't say anything more in response, but I wrote the number down on a small sticky note I stuck to my monitor. An old habit from tracking family debts I thought I'd finally, fully stopped keeping years ago. Old patterns, apparently, don't simply disappear just because you decide to stop participating in them consciously. A week later, my mother called me directly for the first time since the dinner that had ended everything between us, her voice bright and cheerful in a way that immediately set off every alarm bell I had. "I know things have been tense," she began carefully, "but I was hoping we could talk. Just us two." I agreed to meet her for coffee, curious despite myself about what she actually wanted, and mostly wanting to understand what was really happening rather than piecing it together secondhand through Nora and Aunt Diane's fragments. She looked tired in a way her makeup couldn't fully cover anymore. Noticeably older than I remembered her looking. "The wedding's gotten more expensive than we originally planned," she admitted, stirring sugar into coffee she clearly wasn't actually drinking. "Your father's business had a rough patch recently. We're managing it, but it's been stressful for everyone involved." She said it like a small confession, though it was clearly careful setup for something much bigger coming. I asked her directly if this conversation was about money, and she flinched slightly at my bluntness. "I'm not asking you for anything," she said quickly. Too quickly. "I just wanted you to know. In case things came up later on." I recognized the maneuver immediately, laying careful groundwork before the real ask arrived. I told her I appreciated her honesty in that moment, and I genuinely did. Even while fully understanding it wasn't complete honesty at all, just the first careful layer of it. Tested cautiously to see how I'd react before revealing anything closer to the actual, full truth underneath. She asked, almost as a casual afterthought, whether I'd reconsidered anything about the wedding, whether there was a version where I could possibly be there after all now. I told her honestly I hadn't decided yet, which was true. And she seemed to accept that answer, though I could tell it wasn't the response she wanted from me. Driving home from that coffee meeting, I felt the shape of something slowly forming in my mind, not quite a full plan yet, but the growing awareness that events were converging in ways nobody in my family fully understood, and that I was, for once in my life, the only person who could see the whole picture clearly. That night I called Nora and finally told her the entire truth. The whole tangled family history, the uninvitation, the venue connection, all of it laid out plainly. She was quiet for a long moment, absorbing it. "Maya," she finally said, "I had no idea about any of this. This is insane. What do you actually want to do about it?" I told her I didn't know yet exactly, but that I needed her to keep handling the Bennett Cole account exactly as she normally would, professionally, without favoritism or sabotage pushing in either direction. "I'm not trying to punish anyone through the venue itself," I said. "I just need to fully understand the situation first before I decide anything." Nora agreed readily, though I could hear her quietly processing the sheer strangeness of it all. The fact that her business partner's estranged family was about to hold a major wedding in a building we jointly owned together without the faintest idea of the connection sitting right in front of their faces the entire time. Over the following days, I learned more specific details through Nora's careful updates. The caterer was demanding the outstanding balance before proceeding any further. The florist had raised real concerns about a partial payment received, and the coordinator was fielding increasingly tense, frantic calls from my mother about the ballooning wedding budget. My father's landscaping contract with the Coles subdivision, it turned out through more digging, had a payment structure tied directly to construction milestones he hadn't actually been hitting on schedule, which fully explained the sudden cash crunch. He'd apparently promised aggressive, unrealistic timelines to impress Gerald Cole, timelines his own crew simply couldn't physically meet. I started to understand the full shape of what was actually happening around me. My father had overextended himself badly trying to prove his worth to a wealthier family. My mother had spent months carefully projecting an image of effortless success, and Chloe's entire wedding had become collateral damage in their shared need to appear a certain way to outsiders. It was, in some strange and uncomfortable sense, the exact same dynamic I'd lived under my entire life, just aimed at a different audience now instead of me. They'd once needed me to maintain the illusion of stability for the family. Now they needed the Coles to believe that illusion themselves. Without me there quietly patching the holes for them anymore. I felt something close to sympathy for them, briefly, before quickly remembering that this same family had removed me from a wedding website and served me a scripted boundary speech over roast chicken less than a month earlier. Sympathy and cold clarity apparently able to coexist without fully canceling each other out inside me. My cousin Ben, who worked adjacent to the wedding industry as a freelance photographer, mentioned in a group text one evening that he'd heard through a mutual contact that there was some drama with the Bennett wedding vendors, confirming that whatever was happening had grown large enough to reach well outside our immediate family circle now. I asked him, carefully, exactly what he'd heard through the grapevine, and he said only that a caterer had threatened to walk entirely if a balance wasn't settled soon, and that the Cole side of the family was reportedly asking a lot of pointed questions about the Bennett's overall financial reliability lately. That particular detail landed heavier than the rest of what he'd shared with me. If Gerald Cole was genuinely the kind of man who did serious due diligence on the family his son was marrying into, then my father's cash crunch wasn't just a private embarrassment anymore. It was a real potential threat to Chloe's entire engagement, something none of them had fully accounted for. I thought seriously about warning Chloe directly, texting her the fragments I already knew about the situation, but something held me back from doing it right away. An instinct telling me she needed to see this unfold clearly on her own, without me once again quietly absorbing the crisis on everyone else's behalf as usual. Instead, I focused my attention on the Renfield side of things, asking Nora, in general terms only, How the venue typically handled clients facing genuine payment difficulties. Depends on the situation, she said. Sometimes we work out a manageable plan together. Sometimes, if it's bad enough overall, we have grounds to cancel the booking outright and keep the deposit paid. The idea sat with me uncomfortably for days afterward. I didn't want to be the actual reason my sister's wedding collapsed entirely. Not out of some performative moral high ground I wanted to occupy, but because Chloe herself hadn't done anything wrong to deserve that outcome. Whatever her parents' financial recklessness had already set fully in motion. At the same time, I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful settling over me, that I was under absolutely no obligation to quietly fix a crisis I hadn't caused myself, in a family that had explicitly told me my presence, and by clear implication my usefulness, was entirely conditional and disposable whenever convenient. My therapist, when I brought this new development to our next session, asked a simple question that stuck with me for days afterward, turning over and over in my mind. What would you tell a client in this exact situation, if this weren't your own family at all? The clarity of that simple reframing was almost dizzying to sit with. I would tell a client plainly that they were under no obligation whatsoever to rescue people who had already discarded them, that boundaries meant absolutely nothing if they evaporated the moment guilt or manufactured urgency appeared, and that the healthiest possible response was often simply to let natural consequences land exactly where they would naturally fall on their own. Some old, familiar loyalty pulled at me anyway. Not for my parents exactly, but genuinely for Chloe, who was, in the end, mostly an innocent bystander in her own parents' financial recklessness, inheriting a crisis she hadn't personally created and didn't yet fully understand the true scope of it all. I decided, tentatively but with growing conviction, that if the moment ever came, I would ultimately help, but strictly on terms I set myself this time, not terms extracted through manufactured guilt or engineered urgency, and absolutely not terms that quietly erased the truth of what had actually happened over the past difficult months. 2 weeks before the wedding, Nora called with an update that made the entire timeline suddenly, sharply real for the first time. They missed another payment deadline today, she said. The caterer's given them until Friday to pay the remaining balance in full, or they're pulling out completely. Just 3 days before the wedding if it slips that far. I asked what the total remaining balance actually amounted to, across the caterer, the venue itself, and any outstanding vendor costs combined together. Nora pulled up the full file quickly. All in, including the venue balance and vendor shortfalls, the coordinator flagged this week, somewhere around $38,000. If absolutely nothing changes before then. The number landed with an eerie, almost theatrical precision that made the hair on my arms stand up. As if the universe had been quietly tallying this exact bill the entire time and was finally, patiently ready to present it in full. I wrote it down beneath the earlier sticky note, the two numbers now sitting side by side on my monitor like a warning. I didn't tell my parents any of this that I already knew. I let the days pass quietly, watching from a distance I'd never once occupied before during any previous family crisis, feeling both a strange guilt and a strange clarity about my own restraint. Like a muscle I hadn't known I possessed was finally, fully engaging for the first time. Chloe called on a Tuesday night, her voice tight and shaking with barely contained panic underneath the words. Something seriously wrong with the wedding budget, she said. Mom and Dad won't tell me exactly what's happening, but Preston's parents keep asking pointed questions, and I don't know what to say to them anymore. Maya, honestly, I asked her, gently, what she actually wanted to know from me, and she admitted quietly that she suspected our father had overextended himself badly trying to impress the Coles, but that every single time she asked directly, she got vague reassurances instead of any real, concrete answers about what was actually going on. I feel like I'm planning my own wedding around a secret I'm not even allowed to see clearly, she said, and something in her voice reminded me painfully of myself at her exact age. sensing something wrong deep in the family machinery but being systematically denied the information needed to understand it fully and clearly. I told her, carefully choosing my words, that I didn't have all the details myself either, which was mostly true, though I deliberately withheld the parts one did know. Still unsure how much of it was mine to reveal right now versus mine to simply let unfold in whatever order the truth naturally wanted to arrive in. "Do you think they'll ask you for money?" she asked suddenly, and the sheer directness of the question startled me completely. I told her honestly that I genuinely didn't know, but that if they did eventually ask, it wouldn't be a simple, automatic yes this time around. Not after absolutely everything that had already happened between us. "I don't blame you at all," Chloe said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been thinking a lot lately about how much you've always covered for this family, and how little any of us ever actually said thank you for it properly. I'm sorry, Maya. I should have said something a long time ago. Honestly, it was the very first time anyone in my entire family had acknowledged, out loud and directly, the years of quiet financial rescue I'd consistently provided, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly at hearing it, not fully healed by any means, but no longer entirely alone in carrying its ache anymore. We talked for almost an hour that night, longer than we had in months combined, circling around the wedding itself but also touching on things we hadn't discussed openly in years. Our shared childhood, the different ways our parents had shaped each of us, and the quiet guilt she carried for staying silent through my uninvitation. "I want you at my wedding," she said again, more firmly this time, her voice steady. "Not because Mom and Dad need something from you right now. Because you're my sister and I genuinely miss you and none of this feels right or real without you actually there." I believed her completely, and it mattered more to me than I expected it to. I told her I needed a little more time to think everything through, that whatever happened with the money situation, my presence at the wedding couldn't be conditional on rescuing it financially, and she agreed readily, saying she understood, even if she didn't fully grasp yet how close that particular crisis actually was to boiling over completely. After we hung up that night, I sat with a strange, complicated mixture of tenderness and resolve settling over me, understanding clearly that whatever came next needed to happen with Chloe fully protected from the worst of the fallout, even as our parents faced consequences they had, in every meaningful sense, built entirely for themselves over years. 3 days before the wedding, my phone rang at 7 in the morning, my mother's name lighting up the screen with an urgency that felt entirely different from every previous call before it. Sharper. More genuinely desperate. Finally stripped of its careful, performative calm that she'd maintained for weeks. I let it ring twice before answering, steadying myself first. Some deep instinct telling me this was the exact call the entire past year had been quietly, inexorably building toward. "Maya," my mother said the moment I picked up, her voice cracking in a way I genuinely never heard from her before. "We need your help. Please." I asked her to explain calmly what was actually happening, and the whole story spilled out in broken fragments. The caterer's final deadline arriving, the florist threatening to cancel outright, the venue balance still fully outstanding, and beneath all of it, my father's entire subdivision contract collapsing after the Coles quietly pulled back their initial investment amid growing doubts. "Gerald Cole had someone look into your father's finances directly," she said, her voice thick with genuine humiliation now. "They found out about the loans, the missed payments, everything. He's absolutely furious. He's threatening to postpone the wedding entirely, unless we can show him we have things fully under control." The irony of that exact phrase almost made me laugh out loud despite everything. "How much do you actually need from me?" asked, though I already knew the precise number. Had known it for over a week now. Watched it sit quietly on a sticky note on my monitor like a slow, silent countdown clock that nobody else in the world could see or understand. $38,000, she said. And then, quickly, desperately, the words tumbling out. "I know how this all looks. I know exactly what we did to you. But this isn't about us anymore. Maya, this is about Chloe's entire future. About whether the Coles even let this wedding happen at all now. I sat with the silence for a long, heavy moment. Long enough that my mother said my name twice, checking anxiously if the call had somehow dropped between us. "I'm here," I said finally, quietly. "I need some real time to think about this properly. I'll call you back tonight." I hung up before she could argue further. I called Nora immediately afterward, my hands shaking slightly as I dialed, and told her everything that had just happened on the phone. "They have no idea," Nora said slowly, putting all the pieces together in real time as I spoke. "They have absolutely no idea you're the actual reason that venue even exists for their daughter's wedding at all." "Not yet," I said firmly. "But I think it's finally time they found out the truth. Not out of spite or revenge. Because I'm done being quietly useful to people who've made it abundantly clear I'm not truly valued. And the only real way to end that pattern is to make sure the full truth becomes visible to everyone involved." Nora asked what exactly I wanted to do next. Practically speaking. And I told her I needed the complete, full breakdown of the remaining balance across every single vendor, including the venue's own outstanding portion. Everything itemized clearly and precisely, because whatever happened next needed to happen with completely accurate, undeniable information in hand. She sent it within the hour. $11,000 for the caterer's final balance, $6,000 for the florist and outstanding rental fees combined, $4,000 owed directly to smaller vendors my father had apparently promised personal payment to, and the remaining $17,000 as the Renfield's own unpaid venue balance sitting on the books. Seeing the venue balance broken out so clearly on the page hit me differently than I had expected it to. My own business, the one my parents had never once asked a single real question about in years, was actually owed money by my own family, who had absolutely no idea the check they desperately needed to write would ultimately come right back to me anyway. I called my grandmother's attorney that afternoon, more out of pure instinct than any real necessity, just to reread the exact trust language one more time carefully. The note about doors and right moments returning to me now with entirely new weight. This felt unmistakably and undeniably like the exact moment she'd written that note anticipating years earlier. That evening, I drove straight to my parents' house instead of simply calling back as I'd promised earlier, wanting desperately to see their faces when I finally said what I needed to say. Wanting the conversation to happen in person, entirely on my own terms, in the very same house where I'd once been so casually uninvited. My mother opened the door looking like she hadn't slept in days, my father hovering anxiously behind her in the hallway, and Chloe, unexpectedly, already sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, clearly having been told at least part of what was happening in the hour since I'd last spoken to her directly. "I know about the venue balance," I said, before anyone else in the room could speak first, and I watched my mother's face shift rapidly through confusion into something much closer to dread. "I know exactly how much you owe. To every single vendor, including the Renfield itself." My father's fork, once again, stopped completely mid-motion in the air. "How could you possibly know that already?" my mother asked, her voice thin and shaking slightly. I let the silence stretch just long enough to feel deliberate before finally answering her directly. "Because I own 40% of the Renfield. Have for 3 full years now. You've been planning your daughter's entire wedding in a venue I personally helped build." The kitchen went completely, utterly silent. The kind of silence that has real physical weight to it, that presses against your ears from every direction. Chloe's mouth opened slightly, no sound coming out at all. My father set down his fork entirely now, staring at me like he was seeing a stranger sitting in his own daughter's usual chair. "That's not possible," my mother said, though her voice had lost every trace of its earlier certainty. "You never said anything to us about this. All this time. You let us book there, plan there, spend our savings there, and you said absolutely nothing the entire time." I felt the sharp accusation in her tone and, for the first time ever, refused to absorb it as guilt. "You didn't ask," I said simply, evenly. The same way you never once asked where the money came from when Dad's payroll got covered, or when Chloe's tuition mysteriously appeared, or any of the $61,000 I've quietly given this family over the past decade without a single thank you offered in return. My father's face drained completely of color at that number. 61,000, he repeated slowly, like the figure itself was a direct accusation against him. Maya, we never once asked you to keep a running tally of any of it. I told him that was exactly the entire problem. That not asking didn't mean not owing. It simply meant never acknowledging it. Chloe finally spoke up herself, her voice shaking badly now. You own the venue. My venue. And you let me plan my entire wedding there without saying a single word about it. I turned to her gently, because she genuinely deserved gentleness in a way our parents currently didn't. I didn't even know it was your venue until months after you'd already booked it fully. Why didn't you tell us once you actually found out the truth? My mother demanded, some of her old sharpness returning even now in the middle of the crisis. I looked at her steadily, unflinching. Because 3 weeks before I found out, you sat me down at this exact table and told me I wasn't welcome at my own sister's wedding anymore. My father rubbed his face slowly with both hands, the exhausted gesture of a man watching multiple collapsing structures fall apart all at once around him. Gerald Cole already thinks this whole family is unstable, he said, mostly to himself under his breath. If he finds out about this too, about the money, about all of it, he'll call off the entire wedding immediately. That's not my problem to fix quietly this time around, I said, and I genuinely meant it. Though watching my father's real, visceral fear made the words harder to hold onto firmly than I'd expected them to be. But I didn't come here tonight to watch Chloe's wedding collapse either. I came here to tell you the truth, finally. On my own terms. My mother's careful composure cracked fully open then, tears coming fast and unglamorous now. Nothing at all like the careful, calculated crying she'd done during our earlier coffee meeting downtown. What do you want from us, Maya? An apology? Fine. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry for all of it. Just please help us fix this mess. I told her plainly that an apology delivered under financial duress, 3 days before a wedding, wasn't remotely the same thing as an apology freely given without any pressure attached, and that we both knew that perfectly well already. She didn't argue the point at all, which told me she understood exactly what I meant, even amid her rising panic. Chloe, quiet until this exact moment, suddenly stood up sharply from the table. I need everyone in this room to stop talking for a second, she said, her voice steadier than I would have expected given everything currently unfolding around her. Mom. Dad, how long has this been happening? The money from Maya. All of it. For how many years? My mother hesitated visibly, and Chloe pressed harder, refusing to let it go this time. How long? She repeated firmly, and something new in her tone made it absolutely clear she wasn't going to accept any more vagueness this time. Not anymore. Not after everything currently crashing down around her 3 days before her own wedding day. Years, my father finally admitted quietly, the fight seemingly draining completely out of him all at once as he spoke. Since you were in college, at the very least, probably even longer than that, we never meant for it to become a permanent pattern. Chloe. Just kept happening, and we honestly got used to it over time. Chloe turned slowly to face me now, tears in her eyes too, but different tears than my mother's, sharper somehow, more clear-eyed and focused. You paid for my tuition, she said slowly, like she was rebuilding her entire personal history in real time as she spoke. I always thought that scholarship covered everything I needed. Mom told me it covered all of it. It didn't, I said quietly, gently. It covered about 60% of the total cost. I covered the rest myself, quietly, without saying anything. I never wanted you to feel like you owed me anything at all for it. I just genuinely wanted you to be okay, and not have to worry about the money. Chloe pressed her hand hard over her mouth. All this time, she said, mostly directed at our parents now, her voice rising with emotion. You let me believe I earned all of it myself, completely on my own. You let me think Maya just, I don't know, didn't care as much, wasn't around as much, when really she was the entire reason half my adult life actually worked at all. My mother had absolutely no response ready for that. Her carefully constructed narrative finally colliding head-on with a version of events she could no longer control or reshape to suit herself. My father simply stared down at the table in silence, the quiet stretching long enough that the kitchen clock's steady ticking became clearly audible in the tense room. I'm not saying any of this to hurt you, I told Chloe gently, and I genuinely meant it. Watching her absorb an entire decade of quiet family mythology unraveling completely in a single evening. I'm saying it because I'm done being invisible in a story where I did most of the actual heavy lifting the entire time. Chloe nodded slowly, wiping her eyes carefully, and then turned back to face our parents with a new firmness I genuinely never quite seen from her before in my life. We're not asking Maya for any money unless she offers it herself, freely and willingly. And unless she's fully, genuinely welcome at my wedding regardless of whatever she ultimately decides. My mother started to protest immediately. Something about optics and the Coles' expectations, and Chloe cut her off sharply. A sharpness that startled all three of us in the room. No. Mom. I mean it completely. I'm not marrying into a family that's apparently been built on the exact same secrets we've been running on for years now. I felt something entirely unfamiliar rise slowly in my chest watching my little sister, the golden child, the one who'd never once had to fight for a seat at any table growing up, finally stand up firmly for fairness in a room that had spent 30 straight years training both of us not to expect it at all. I still don't know if I can actually fix the money situation for you both, I told them honestly, meeting each of their eyes in turn. But I can tell you this much for certain. Whatever happens next happens with everyone finally seeing the full truth clearly. No more carefully managed narratives. No more quiet debts nobody ever acknowledges out loud. My father, still staring down at the table, finally looked up slowly to meet my eyes. What do you need from us, Maya? Just tell us plainly. Whatever it is. We'll do it. For the first time in longer than I could genuinely remember, he sounded like he was actually asking a real question, not performing one he'd already fully decided the answer to. I told them I needed a full night to think everything through properly, that I wasn't making major decisions under pressure in their kitchen the way they'd apparently hoped I would, and I left again. Though this time the silence following me out the front door felt entirely, fundamentally different from before. I drove straight to Nora's apartment instead of going home that night, needing to think somewhere that didn't carry 30 years of accumulated family weight pressing down in its walls. She poured us 2 generous glasses of wine and listened patiently to the entire kitchen confrontation without interrupting me once throughout the whole retelling. So what's the actual plan here? She finally asked once I'd finished. I told her I wasn't fully sure yet, but that whatever I ultimately decided, it needed to protect Chloe's wedding without simply erasing what our parents had done, without letting them quietly slide back into the same old pattern the moment this particular crisis fully passed. You could just let the venue balance go completely unpaid, Nora said carefully, watching my face. As co-owner, that's genuinely your call as much as it is mine. We could cancel the booking entirely, outright. Nobody reasonable would blame you at all, given everything that's happened. I sat with the idea, feeling its full weight, understanding both its appeal and its real cost equally. I don't want Chloe's wedding to become collateral damage in a fight that isn't actually hers to begin with, I said slowly, thinking it through. But I also don't want to just quietly write another check and let everyone go right back to pretending nothing ever happened here. There has to be some version of this that genuinely changes something lasting. Nora suggested something then that I honestly hadn't considered on my own, structuring my help not as a simple gift this time, but as a formal, fully documented arrangement, complete with clear repayment terms and, crucially, full transparency with the Cole family about exactly what had happened and who had actually stabilized the entire situation quietly. If the Coles are doing due diligence on this family anyway, she said thoughtfully, let them see the full, complete picture clearly. Let them see that the family they're worried about actually has someone in it who handles things with real integrity. That's not nothing at all, Maya. That might genuinely matter more than any single check you could write. The idea settled into place with a click I felt almost physically in my chest. A real plan finally taking shape that didn't require me to either abandon Chloe entirely or quietly absorb another decade of unspoken family debt going forward. I called my grandmother's attorney again that same night, later than was probably considered polite for a call. We spent nearly an hour on the phone together constructing careful terms. I would cover the outstanding balance in full, but as a formal loan made specifically to my parents, not to Chloe at all, with clear repayment terms attached, and with full disclosure to the Cole family about the actual financial history involved, presented calmly and factually. I called Chloe first thing the next morning, before calling our parents at all, wanting her to hear the full plan directly from me rather than filtered through anyone else's fear or spin on the situation. I'm going to help, I told her plainly. But it's going to look very different than anything Mom and Dad are currently expecting from me. I explained the entire structure to her carefully, the loan terms, the disclosure to the Coles, all of it laid out plainly. Chloe was quiet for a long moment before finally saying, "That's fair. More than fair. Honestly, given everything, I think Mom and Dad genuinely need to actually face this fully, instead of just having it quietly disappear again like always." "Are you completely sure about this?" I asked her, aware I was asking her to accept a much harder, more exposed version of her own wedding week in exchange for a more genuinely honest one. "I'm sure," she said firmly, without hesitation. "I don't want to start my marriage the exact same way this family's been running for years now. Hidden and pretend." I called my parents next, laying out the full terms plainly for them, without softening any of it the way I might have chosen to a year earlier. My mother tried, briefly, to negotiate around the disclosure piece specifically, suggesting we could frame it a bit differently to the Coles, and I told her calmly there was no framing left to offer anyone. "They're going to find out regardless of what we do," I said firmly. "Gerald Cole already has people actively looking into this family's finances right now. The only real choice you actually have left is whether the truth comes from you, honestly and directly, or from someone else entirely, later. Looking far worse because you tried desperately to hide it first." My father, to his genuine credit, agreed almost immediately without much resistance, something in his tired voice suggesting real exhaustion with the entire performance itself, relief even, at the idea of finally not having to maintain an image that had clearly been costing him far more than any of us had fully understood until now. "We'll do it your way completely," he said quietly. "Whatever you need from us. Just, thank you. Maya, I know we don't really deserve it right now, given everything. But thank you sincerely." I told him I appreciated hearing that, and that real thanks would matter far more once it was actually demonstrated through changed behavior over time, not just spoken during a moment of crisis. Nora and I spent the entire following day finalizing all the vendor payments together, working closely with the coordinator to secure the caterer, confirm the florist fully, and settle every outstanding balance across all the accounts, all while drafting the formal loan agreement with my grandmother's attorney carefully reviewing every single line of the document. I insisted on one additional condition myself, one I hadn't mentioned to my parents yet at all. I wanted to be formally, publicly reinstated as a full guest at the wedding, not quietly slipped back in through a side door, but properly acknowledged, with my mother personally correcting the wedding website and informing the extended family directly herself. My mother agreed without any argument this time around, and I felt, watching that surprisingly easy agreement unfold, The strange power of finally holding real leverage in a relationship that had spent decades simply assuming I'd never once use any leverage I actually had. It wasn't exactly triumphant. It was just, finally, genuinely fair for once. 2 days before the wedding, my parents requested a formal meeting with the entire Cole family and asked, somewhat awkwardly through my mother, if I would be present for it too. Given my direct and significant role in resolving the financial situation, everyone now fully understood, had nearly derailed the entire wedding event completely. I agreed to attend, mostly for Chloe's sake more than anything else, wanting to see with my own eyes how the Coles actually received this difficult information, and whether Preston's family was genuinely the kind of people who valued real honesty over careful performance, a distinction that would matter enormously for my sister's entire future marriage. We met at a quiet restaurant near downtown Denver. Gerald and Patricia Cole arriving precisely on time as expected, dressed with the understated confidence of people who never once needed to prove anything to anyone in the room. Preston sat beside Chloe throughout, holding her hand under the table, clearly aware something significant was about to be discussed openly. My father spoke first, more honestly than I had ever once heard him speak in my entire life, laying out the full financial strain, the overextension, the missed contract milestones, all without minimizing or spinning any single part of it. It was, in its own genuinely difficult way, the single bravest thing I had ever personally seen him do. Gerald Cole listened without interrupting even once, his expression completely unreadable throughout the entire explanation, and when my father finally finished speaking, he turned his full attention directly to me instead. And you're the daughter who stepped in, he said, not quite phrasing it as a question. The one who apparently wasn't even invited to this wedding until quite recently. From what I understand, I confirmed it plainly, without any embellishment or lingering bitterness in my voice, and watched something shift subtly in his expression, a real recalculation happening quietly behind his eyes. That's an interesting family dynamic, he said carefully, choosing his words. The one who gets excluded turning out to be the one who actually holds everything together underneath it all. The rehearsal dinner itself, held the following evening in a private room adjoining the Renfield's main hall, was where everything I had carefully arranged over the past 2 intense days finally collided together in front of the full wedding party, extended family, and the Cole family gathered together for the first time all at once. My mother had insisted on maintaining the usual toast tradition, parents speaking first before anyone else, and she stood up with a glass of champagne in hand, her voice bright and performative in a way that immediately put me back on high alert. Some old instinct recognizing the careful narrative construction already underway before she'd even finished her first full sentence. We are so incredibly grateful, she began smoothly, for everyone who helped make this beautiful wedding possible, especially our own family, who came together during a genuinely stressful season to fully support Chloe and Preston. It was technically true in the loosest sense and completely dishonest all at once, carefully erasing every specific detail that actually mattered here. I felt my jaw tighten involuntarily, watching her attempt to smooth over the exact story she'd personally promised, just 2 days earlier, to tell honestly and fully. Across the crowded room, Gerald Cole's expression flickered slightly, the practiced neutrality of a man who clearly noticed exactly what wasn't being said out loud in the moment. My father, standing quietly beside my mother, glanced briefly over at me, and something in his face suggested he felt the exact same discomfort I did. Watching the carefully negotiated honesty already curdling right back into familiar family varnish the moment a room full of watching witnesses had actually appeared before them. Chloe, seated at the head table, set down her fork audibly enough that several heads turned in her direction immediately. "Mom," she said, her clear voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet room, "I think we should actually tell everyone what really happened. All of it. Completely. Isn't that what we specifically agreed on together?" The room's entire temperature seemed to drop several noticeable degrees all at once. My mother's champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips mid-motion, Every single eye in the room now shifting rapidly between Chloe and our mother, waiting tensely to see which version of the evening was actually going to unfold in front of them. Chloe. Sweetheart. This really isn't the right time, my mother said, her smile turning visibly brittle at the edges. But Chloe stood up fully anyway, smoothing down her dress calmly, her voice remarkably steady in a way that made it abundantly clear she'd been quietly waiting for exactly this moment to finally arrive. 3 days ago, my parents asked my own sister for $38,000, Chloe said plainly, her voice ringing out clearly, and the entire room went utterly, completely silent. Forks paused midair everywhere, Patricia Cole's eyebrows lifting slightly in genuine surprise. The wedding almost fell apart entirely because of money problems nobody told me the full truth about. My mother's face drained completely of color, her carefully rehearsed toast fully abandoned mid-thought now. My father set down his own glass slowly, not stopping Chloe at all. Some part of him apparently genuinely relieved to finally see the truth leaving someone else's mouth for once instead of always having to carry it himself. My sister wasn't even invited to this wedding a full month ago, Chloe continued firmly, her voice thickening noticeably with emotion but never quite breaking under the pressure. She was uninvited entirely because our parents were worried about optics, about what the Coles might possibly think of us. Turns out, the actual real problem was never Maya at all. A low murmur moved steadily through the extended family tables scattered around the room, aunts and cousins exchanging startled glances with each other, some clearly already aware of scattered fragments of the story, others hearing the full complete shape of it for the very first time live, right in front of the exact family my parents had been so desperate to impress. Maya has been quietly holding this entire family together financially for years now, Chloe said, turning slightly to face me directly. Tuition costs. Bro. This whole wedding. All of it. And none of us ever really thanked her properly for any of it, because we were all too busy assuming it was simply what she was naturally supposed to do. I felt genuine heat rise sharply in my face, completely unprepared for the full spotlight even though I had anticipated some version of the truth surfacing publicly tonight. Gerald Cole was watching me intently now, his expression unreadable but clearly intent, evidently recalculating the entire family. He was watching his own son marry into right before his eyes. And, Chloe added, her voice softening noticeably now, I found out just 2 days ago that Maya actually owns part of this very venue. Part of the exact building we're all standing in right now tonight. She helped save my entire wedding, and my parents almost let their own pride keep her out of it completely. The room's murmur grew noticeably louder at that revelation, several relatives turning to look up at the exposed brick walls and dramatic skylights around them with fresh, startled interest, almost as if the building itself had just suddenly become a living character in the extraordinary story unfolding directly in front of them all. My mother finally found her voice again, thin and visibly shaking now. Chloe. Please sit back down. We can discuss all of this privately later on. Chloe shook her head firmly, refusing. No. Mom. We agreed together to be fully honest tonight. This is exactly what honest actually looks like. I'm done pretending everything's fine when it clearly isn't. Preston, standing beside Chloe throughout, reached up and took her hand firmly in his, standing there with her. A quiet gesture of unwavering support that seemed to settle something important in the room, signaling clearly to his own family that whatever was unfolding had his full, complete endorsement. Not any hint of his discomfort. Patricia Cole spoke up for the very first time that evening, her voice measured but genuinely not unkind at all. I appreciate this honesty tonight, she said, looking carefully between Chloe and my parents in turn. Frankly, more families should probably have moments exactly like this before a wedding rather than discovering it painfully after one has already happened. Gerald Cole nodded slowly at his wife's words, still watching me carefully. Rick, he said, turning directly to my father now, you told me your business was in a genuinely strong position when we first discussed the subdivision contract together. That wasn't entirely true, was it? If we're being honest right now. My father's shoulders sagged visibly. But he didn't look away from him. No, my father admitted quietly. In front of absolutely everyone gathered now. It wasn't true at all. I overextended myself badly trying to prove I could handle a contract that size successfully. I should have been honest with you from the very start instead of letting my own daughter quietly fix it all behind the scenes without credit. Which daughter exactly? Gerald asked pointedly, a sharp edge entering his voice now. And my father's answer came without any hesitation this time at all. Maya, he said clearly. It's always been Maya. Honestly. I think somewhere along the way, we simply forgot that gratitude was actually supposed to be part of the whole arrangement between us. I hadn't expected to hear my father say that particular thing so plainly, in front of extended family and the entire Cole family both, and something in my chest loosened noticeably at hearing it. Not full forgiveness yet, not even close, but genuinely the beginning of something that might eventually, someday, become room for it to grow. My mother, still standing awkwardly there with her abandoned toast in hand, finally set down her champagne glass entirely on the table. I owe you a real apology. Maya, she said, her voice smaller than I had ever once heard it sound before. Not just for the wedding itself. For years of simply assuming you'd handle things without ever needing to be truly seen. The whole room stayed quiet, waiting expectantly. And I felt the full weight of every single eye on me now, including Gerald and Patricia Coles, including cousins and aunts who had spent the entire last month hearing whatever fragmented version of events had reached them first through the various family gossip channels circulating. I'm not particularly interested in apologies that only happen because we got caught, I said finally, my voice noticeably steadier than I had expected it to be in the moment. I'm interested in whether anything actually changes after tonight is over. Whether I actually get treated like a real daughter instead of a financial safety net going forward from here. My mother nodded slowly at that, tears finally spilling over freely now. And for once they genuinely didn't feel performative to me at all. They felt entirely like the real thing. Arriving far too late admittedly, but arriving nonetheless. I want that outcome, she said quietly. I don't know exactly how we get there together, but I truly want to try. Genuinely this time. Gerald Cole raised his glass unexpectedly then, cutting cleanly through the lingering tension with the easy natural authority of a man clearly used to redirecting entire rooms full of people. To honesty, he said simply and firmly, and to the people who quietly hold families together even when they're never properly thanked for it. To Maya, specifically. The room raised their glasses hesitantly at first, then more fully and genuinely, the toast slowly becoming something entirely unplanned and real, completely different from whatever careful speech my mother had originally prepared for the evening. I felt tears prick unexpectedly at my own eyes, entirely undignified, and entirely earned after everything that had happened. Chloe crossed the room quickly and hugged me tightly, whispering directly into my ear. Thank you for not just quietly fixing this the way you always used to do before. Thank you for letting it actually be seen by everyone this time. I held her back just as tightly, understanding fully that this moment mattered more than any single check I'd ever written. Preston shook my hand warmly afterward, his grip firm and genuine, his expression completely sincere. I'm clearly marrying into quite a remarkable family, he said, half joking and half genuinely impressed at once. I had no idea my future sister-in-law was this formidable. Chloe's genuinely lucky to have you. Even if it took everyone a while to finally see it clearly. My father approached me quietly later. Once the room had settled back into softer, quieter conversation around us. His eyes red-rimmed in a way I had rarely witnessed from him before in my life. I don't know exactly how to make up for years of this, Maya, he said. But I genuinely like the chance to try. If you'll let me. I told him I appreciated that offer, and that the actual trying itself would need to show up consistently in real actions going forward. Not just in words spoken during the emotional wake of public exposure tonight. He nodded, accepting those terms without any argument. Something entirely new visible in his expression now. Humility instead of performance for once. My mother found me near the very end of the evening, standing away from the thinning crowd. Her makeup finally worn through completely by real tears rather than any carefully calculated ones. "The venue," she said quietly, almost to herself. "You've owned it this entire time. Watching us plan here week after week. And you never once said a word about it. I didn't know it was actually your venue when I first started helping with the planning process." I told her honestly, meeting her eyes. "Once I found out the truth, I genuinely didn't know how to tell you without it immediately becoming about the money all over again instead of about us as a family, as people." She nodded slowly at that, absorbing it fully, and then said something I genuinely hadn't expected to hear from her at all. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you right now. You know. She always said you were the one who really saw this entire family clearly for what it was. I used to think she was just being overly dramatic. I honestly don't think that anymore." I told her then about the note, the one about doors and right moments, and my mother's face crumpled slightly hearing it described, understanding perhaps for the very first time how thoroughly Eleanor had anticipated exactly this entire unraveling long before any of the rest of us ever saw it coming ourselves at all. "She tried to warn me too. Once," my mother admitted quietly. "Years ago. At Christmas dinner. She told me directly that I was going to lose you eventually if I kept treating your help like it was simply owed to me instead of being freely given. I didn't listen to her then. I truly wish I had listened, Maya. Honestly. I didn't have a neat, tidy response ready for that particular confession. Some wounds simply too old and deeply layered to fully resolve in a single conversation. But I let myself sit quietly in the honesty of it anyway, appreciating it even without full resolution yet. Understanding that real repair was always a slow process rather than one single dramatic evening. The formal loan agreement, signed the following morning before the actual wedding ceremony itself, structured a clear repayment schedule spread over 3 full years, with interest set deliberately low, not as any kind of punishment, but as a mechanism to ensure the debt stayed visible, acknowledged, and real, rather than quietly absorbed and forgotten the way past debts always had been before. My father insisted on adding one additional clause himself, one that neither Nora's attorney nor I had originally suggested, including a formal, written apology attached directly to the agreement, fully acknowledging the years of unpaid family debt beyond just the wedding costs alone. A document he specifically wanted, in his own words, on the record, permanently, forever. I hadn't expected that particular gesture from him specifically, and it moved me far more than I let show at the signing table that morning, watching a man who had spent 30 straight years avoiding any vulnerable admissions finally choose, quite deliberately, to put one down permanently in writing where it couldn't later be minimized or quietly denied by anyone. Gerald Cole. Informed of the fully resolved situation the very next morning, sent a brief but formal message directly to my father expressing genuine respect for how the family had ultimately handled the crisis once everything came fully into the open, along with a note that the subdivision contract would proceed forward, with revised, far more realistic milestones this time around. My father called me immediately after receiving that message, his voice thick with obvious relief, and something that sounded almost like genuine disbelief underneath it. "He's giving me another chance," he said, his voice unsteady, "because of how we handled it together. Because of how you specifically handled it. Really. Thank you, Maya. I truly mean that. Sincerely." The wedding day itself arrived clear and bright that morning, the kind of crisp October day that made the distant mountains visible from nearly every window in the city. And I stood in the Renfield's dressing room helping Chloe carefully with the final buttons on her gown. Exactly the kind of role I'd always secretly wanted to play in her life. "You look absolutely beautiful," I told her sincerely, and meant it completely. Watching my little sister transform slowly in the very same mirror I'd once helped personally decorate for 100 other couples' weddings before. never once imagining it would eventually reflect my own family's single most honest moment together. Chloe turned to face me fully before the ceremony began. Her eyes bright with unshed tears, she was clearly fighting hard to preserve her carefully applied makeup. "I want you standing up there with me today," she said suddenly. Decisively. "Not just seated in the audience somewhere. I want my actual sister standing right beside me when I get married today." I hadn't expected that particular offer at all. Hadn't planned for it in any way. But I found myself nodding before I'd even fully processed what she'd just asked. Understanding clearly that this was Chloe's own genuine version of the reinstatement I'd insisted on weeks earlier. Freely given now. Not negotiated or demanded. Simply offered from the heart. Walking down the aisle beside my sister's bridal party. Past rows and rows of family and friends. Past Gerald and Patricia Cole sitting there with genuine warmth visible on their faces. Past my own parents holding hands tightly in the front row looking humbled rather than performing. Felt like walking straight into an entirely different family than the one I'd left just 3 weeks earlier. The ceremony itself passed in the particular kind of blur that weddings always seem to do. Vows exchanged carefully. Rings placed gently. Preston's hands visibly shaking with real emotion as he looked at Chloe like she was the only person in the entire crowded room. Which, in the way that truly matters, she genuinely was to him. When the officiant finally pronounced them married, the whole room erupted into warm applause. And I found myself crying openly and freely. Completely unashamed. The tears finally arriving for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with a kind of relief I hadn't fully realized I'd been waiting years to actually feel. At the reception afterward, held in the same main hall where I'd first walked through years earlier as a completely silent partner, my father asked me to dance with him during the parent dances, an unusual departure from tradition that made my mother smile warmly rather than object to it at all. "I owe you far more than just one dance," he said quietly as we moved slowly across the crowded floor together. "But I figure this is at least a start for now." I told him it genuinely was, and meant it fully. Understanding that 30 years of accumulated imbalance wouldn't resolve completely overnight, but that overnight wasn't actually the real goal here anymore anyway. My mother pulled me aside quietly later in the evening, handing me a small wrapped box I hadn't expected to receive at all. Inside was a framed photograph of my grandmother, one I had never seen before in my life, taken decades earlier. Her expression sharp and knowing in a way that felt entirely familiar to me now, looking at it. "She left this with me years ago," my mother said softly, "with careful instructions to give it to you whenever the time felt genuinely right. I think tonight is finally that exact time." I held the photograph carefully in both hands, feeling Eleanor's quiet presence in the moment as surely as if she had personally planned this entire evening herself from the start. Nora found me near the bar later that night, grinning widely. "Best wedding we've hosted here all year," she said warmly. "And not just because of all the dramatic revelations either. Your family actually seems, I don't know, genuinely lighter now somehow. Whatever happened this past week, it clearly worked out in the end." I told her I sincerely hoped it would keep working. Aunt Diane approached me carefully during the reception, her earlier fishing for gossip now fully replaced by genuine warmth. "I heard the real story tonight," she said quietly. "I'm truly sorry I doubted you back when the gossip first started circulating. You deserved far better than what this family gave you for such a long time. Maya." Honestly. I told her I appreciated hearing that sincerely, and I truly did. Though I also understood clearly that real, lasting change would be measured over years to come, not over one single dramatic wedding night. However genuinely satisfying the public vindication had felt in the actual moment, however good it had felt to finally have the truth acknowledged so openly. Preston's toast during the dinner surprised absolutely everyone present, veering unexpectedly away from the usual jokes about how the couple had first met toward something far more sincere instead. "I want to personally thank Maya," he said, raising his glass toward my table, "for showing this entire family, mine included, what quiet strength and real honesty actually look like in practice." The room applauded warmly again at that. And I felt my father's steady hand find my shoulder gently, squeezing it once. A wordless acknowledgement that felt somehow more honest than any of the formal speeches given that night. Decades of unspoken understanding finally, imperfectly, beginning to find some real language between us at last. Later that night, after most of the guests had already left and the venue staff began quietly clearing the tables around us, Chloe found me sitting alone near the now empty dance floor, still fully in her wedding dress. Her shoes finally kicked off underneath her chair after hours of dancing. "Thank you," she said simply, sitting down carefully beside me in her gown. "Not just for the money itself, for staying through all of it, for letting all of this happen honestly instead of just quietly fixing it the way you always used to before. I think that honestly mattered more than the check ever could have on its own." I told her that letting things finally be seen clearly had actually been far harder than any amount of quiet fixing I'd ever done in the past, but that it had also, finally, felt like the genuine truth instead of just another careful performance of family harmony we all silently agreed to maintain year after year for everyone's comfort. "What happens now? Going forward?" she asked quietly. "With Mom and Dad? I mean specifically. Do you think it actually sticks this time? Or does everyone just quietly go back to the old patterns once all the wedding excitement fully fades away?" It was a genuinely fair question. One I had been honestly asking myself throughout the entire evening too. "I honestly don't know for certain," I admitted truthfully. "But I do know I'm not going back to being invisible again, regardless of whatever they ultimately choose to do going forward. That part has already changed for good. Whether they keep up their end of it consistently or not. I finally understand my own real worth outside of what I financially provide." Chloe reached over and squeezed my hand gently in hers. "For what it's genuinely worth," she said softly. "I'm not going back to not truly seeing you either. Ever again. I spent far too many years simply assuming things about our family that honestly weren't true at all. I don't intend to make that exact same mistake again. Not with you. Not ever." We sat together quietly for a good while longer, watching the venue staff finish their careful work all around us, the very same room that had once quietly hosted my anonymous investment now standing as the beautiful backdrop for the single most honest night my entire family had genuinely experienced together in years. I thought about Eleanor then, sitting there quietly, about her handwritten note, about doors and right moments arriving exactly when they needed to, and understood finally, completely, what she had truly meant all along. Some difficult truths need exactly the right pressure, the right timing, to surface without simply destroying everything around them in the process of emerging. The following weeks brought small but steady signs of genuinely lasting change, rather than just another temporary performance destined to quietly fade away. My father called weekly now, not to ask me for anything at all, but simply to talk. Awkwardly at first, gradually growing easier over time, the way any new habit slowly becomes familiar through consistent practice. My mother began sending occasional texts too, just simply checking in on me. No hidden agenda attached anywhere. No careful groundwork quietly being laid for some future ask down the line. Felt strange at first, receiving contact without instinctively bracing myself for what it might eventually end up costing me. But the strangeness slowly softened into something resembling real trust. The loan repayments arrived precisely on schedule each and every month, small but entirely consistent, a tangible, physical marker of accountability neither of my parents had ever once offered before in any previous financial arrangement between us. Solid proof that this particular time, the debt wasn't simply going to quietly disappear into family mythology completely unspoken. My father's landscaping business, rebuilt now on far more honest footing with the Coles revised contract terms, began recovering steadily over the following months, and he mentioned to me once, almost shyly, wanting to eventually repay not just the wedding balance itself but portions of the much older accumulated debts too, if I would genuinely let him do that. Chloe and I spoke almost weekly now. The painful distance that had crept steadily between us throughout the wedding drama now fully replaced by something far more solid than we had shared in years, built entirely on actual honesty this time rather than the careful, Assigned roles we'd both been given since early childhood without ever choosing them ourselves. 6 months after the wedding had taken place, my parents hosted a quiet family dinner and, for the very first time in my entire adult life, my mother stood up before the meal even began and simply said, "I want to thank Maya, properly this time, for absolutely everything she's done for this family over so many years now." It wasn't a grand, dramatic gesture at all. No cameras present. No audience beyond our own small family table gathered together. But it landed far heavier than the entire rehearsal dinner speech had months earlier. Precisely because it happened quietly and privately this time, without any crisis forcing its arrival. Simply offered because it was finally, genuinely true at last. The Renfield continued hosting beautiful weddings steadily throughout that entire year. Nora and I occasionally laughing quietly together about the strange, deeply improbable irony of my own family's private crisis having unfolded inside the very same walls I'd once kept carefully secret from them. Out of nothing more than old habit and quiet self-protection built up over years. My own business grew steadily too during that time. Several new clients mentioning to me that they'd heard about the wedding venue owner who saved her sister's big day. The story somehow traveling far further than I had ever originally intended it to, turning what had once been my quietest, most guarded secret into an unexpected source of genuine professional respect. I still think sometimes, even now, about that roast chicken dinner months ago, about the porch light I once drove away from feeling entirely erased from my own family's story. And I understand now, with real clarity, that being uninvited turned out to be the exact rupture my family genuinely needed in order to finally see me clearly for who I truly am. I didn't get revenge in the dramatic way I might have imagined during my angriest moments that whole fall. No dramatic collapse orchestrated out of spite. No wedding deliberately ruined out of bitterness. Just the simple, plain truth, finally spoken aloud. In a room full of witnesses who could no longer pretend not to have clearly heard every single word of it. Some debts get repaid simply in dollars. 38,000 of them exactly. Carefully documented and steadily returned month after month. But the debt that mattered most of all, the one owed in genuine recognition and lasting respect, finally started being repaid the night my entire family learned that the daughter they once tried to erase had been quietly holding the roof up all along. Then